Welcome to this special episode of the CEC report called Derivatives Kill. That's what they're made for. Craig, we're in a huge fight against what's the policy called bail-in, which, as was demonstrated in Cyprus in March of this year, that, for the future, if this policy becomes law in every country where they want it to be, depositors in banks will have their savings confiscated to keep banks going. And they'll have them confiscated to keep banks going, essentially because so banks can keep doing the things that gets them into trouble, and that is gamble in derivatives.
And this policy, Robbie, is being pushed from the top down, from the Bank of International Settlements through the G20, through an organisation called the Financial Stability Board, that's come out and said in April of this year that that there is legislation in train for Australia.
Yep.
So this idea of seizing bank accounts and forcing them into shares, the deposits into shares, is not some sort of pie in the sky idea. It's actively being sought after by the Financial Stability Board as a means of protecting the banks, or propping up the banks, I should say. Now,
we want to focus on ripping back the mask of excuses and focus on what the real intention is here. And when you reduce it right down, the intention of bail-in is to kill people to protect derivatives. Whereas we're fighting for the policy of Glass-Steagall, which will kill derivatives to protect people.
Yes.
Right?
That's the simplest way of putting it, Robbie, because functionally that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Glass-Steagall will split up banks and separate them off, separate the part that holds deposits off from the part that gambles in these crazy instruments. But what are derivatives anyway? Because people might have heard of them, but 99.9999% of people would have no idea what they are really, hence this special CEC report. But to set the scenes though, let's go back a little ways, Craig, to 1971. And that was a key year. And for the viewers, can you just explain to the viewers the general difference in the global economy before 1971 compared to after 1971?
Well, 1971 was the period that Nixon basically floated the US dollar by taking it off gold, and it was the final destruction of the Bretton Woods system, where you had highly regulated, controlled currencies that stabilised everything. So what you see today is a global casino where currencies are traded, millions, if not billions of dollars per day, that affect the very livelihoods of people because they upset the trade and so forth. So everything prior to 1971 was highly regulated and controlled top-down. Banks, foreign trade, currency, interest rates, the whole lot.
Yep.
After 71, casino, doors open, same idea.
Yep, and they called it deregulation, or the overarching term, globalisation, all the privatisation policies. Different countries sort of, opened up at different points. In Australia, it was 1983 when Hawke and Keating came to power. Now, that's important to understand that key date, because derivatives are not a phenomenon that is actually that have been a permanent part of the financial system.
They were actually illegal up until the 90s, Robbie.
Well, they were
considered illegal instruments.
In the nation of Germany, and especially, they banned derivatives under the same laws that banned gambling, right? And Germany did quite well, thank you very much. But once they deregulated, Craig, in 1971, and we've documented how, for example, in London, in the City of London, Lord Jacob Rothschild's banking group formed this collection of banks, which they called the Inter-Alpha Group, and they were unleashed to go around the world literally looting. How do you make money? Not by making long-term investments in productive processes. How can we skim money off the top and force the money more money to the top so we can skim more off, right? And all the deregulation policies, etc., facilitated that. Speculation took over. It reached a fever pitch in the 1980s, which probably most people watching can remember that, right? The age of greed is good. The movie Wall Street, it's all there. We all remember it. And Craig, it all came crashing down in 1987. That 16 years after the Bretton Woods system ended, the world economy was actually bankrupt, right, by this stealing and looting. And at that time, every government should have taken stock and said, no, we've got to go back to putting rules in place that make sure that the financial system works for the productive economy so that we aren't bankrupted. But they didn't do that. And this was the work of Alan Greenspan especially. It was at 1987 he took over as the chairman of the Federal Reserve in America. And what any scholar on derivatives who's honest attributes the beginning of the derivatives bubble that we're going to talk about now to the decision made by Alan Greenspan to let these criminals, these looters, continue looting, but in a more clever way, right? And that more clever way, in a very complicated way, is derivatives. So let's go through it. What are derivatives? There's a standard definition, and I'll read this out, and then we can discuss it briefly. A derivative is a financial instrument whose value is linked to or derived from some other security, such as a stock or bond or a commodity. The most basic forms of derivatives are options and forwards, also known as futures. An option is the right to buy or sell something in the future. A forward is the obligation to buy or sell something in the future. And all derivatives today, Craig, are a combination of either one or both, or a combination of them, right? So here's the thing though. We're going to talk about some exotic ones, but the ones, what we've just named there, futures and options, a lot of people, especially farmers, if we can use farmers as an example, they've got no choice. They're actually quite common, and those ones are about 100 years old. They've been around for a long time, right? But even in their most basic form, a future and an option, they're a step removed from reality.
Yeah, well, the reality for a farmer is if a farmer's producing wheat, Robbie, he can decide, okay, well, I'm going to sell my wheat for this price in the future.
He grows it, he sells it.
Right, but he's already making that decision before he's got a crop, right, because he's trying to get the maximum amount for his crop in a deregulated system. So he might say, I'll sell my wheat for $280 a tonne. I agree to supply in the future, signs a futures contract, 1,000 tonnes of wheat at 200, and I'll be paid $280 by the person that's bought that contract. The problem comes in though, Robbie, is that there's a real function here of growing that wheat.
Yep.
So if anything happens and he doesn't have 1,000 tonnes of wheat, he has to find 1,000 tonnes of wheat, and that's where they fall over. If there's a general collapse of production and the price of wheat goes to $350 a tonne, he's got to pay $70 more for each of those 1,000 tonnes of wheat, because he signed a contract to supply $280 at $280. So it's a complete gamble. Now, this is where, unfortunately, with deregulation, you used to have a strong Australian marketing, a wheat board and so forth, that would say, we are going to pay farmers this amount of money for their product when it is produced. Yep. So there's no gambling involved. It's real.
You're dealing with what's real,
yeah,
as opposed to even the most basic derivatives. You're selling something that doesn't exist yet.
And today, that's what's happening with production today. And with the large introduction of Louis Dreyfus, Cargill, and all these huge grain cartels, there's a huge manipulation process that goes on because they can manipulate prices internationally.
Well, of course, you talked about the farmer side of it. The person that's a contract, there's a counterparty to that contract. The farmer has to take care of growing the wheat. The counterparty can take that contract and go, well, actually, I don't like being in this. I'm going to sell this contract onto somebody else.
And make a profit.
While the farmer's in the season is trying to grow the wheat, these contracts can trade hands thousands of times.
Like oil on the ships,
exactly.
Multiple transactions take place on these contracts because you've got a piece of paper that says this piece of paper is given a value. It doesn't represent it, it's just a piece of paper, but it represents something underlying.
Well, and it's interesting you say oil. It's worth mentioning here as an interesting fact that the price of oil that we're used to now, which is, it jumps below, it sort of hovers below and above $100 a barrel. That's before 2002, it was more in the $30 to $40 a barrel range. And the difference was, before 2002, the only companies that could trade in oil futures were actual oil companies, because that was called hedging. In 2002, the City of London allowed derivatives trading on oil to open in London, not in Wall Street, in London, where London is this lawless enclave. London's the centre of this stuff, Craig, where anybody could buy and sell oil futures and options, and that's what drove the price up to where we are used to it being today, right? Pure gambling. Now, I said they weren't derivatives. We've talked about derivatives that in futures and options on commodities. That's been common for about a century. They weren't a big part of the system before the 1987 crash, though. And the ones that did exist, they were these types of futures contracts. They were mainly traded in Chicago, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade. They were originally on commodities. Then, following the 1971 collapse we've talked about, the futures trading expanded to areas such as currencies, interest rates, and government bonds, right? But then 1987 hit, and so we'll put up on the screen a growth rate here that shows by 1986 combined the two types of derivatives: exchange-traded derivatives, these futures and options that are traded on exchanges, and what's called over-the-counter derivatives. In 1986, total globally added up to 500 billion. And you'll see in 87 that grew to 867 billion. 88 it was 1.3 trillion. 89 2.4 trillion. 1990 3.4 trillion. 1991 4 trillion. 93 30 trillion. 97 70 trillion. The year 2000 100 trillion. And then by 2005 that had skyrocketed to $650 trillion.
It was the 1990s that's the key there. You see that
That's
big
right.
jump. Well, that was when actually Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall in 1999.
Well, look, why don't we, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about this 1990s period and this whole over-the-counter frenzy, and then how it relates to Australia's banks. Welcome back to this special CEC report presentation. Derivatives kill, that's what they're made for. Now, Craig, before the break, we were talking about the standard types of derivatives and the standard definition of derivatives. Let me give you an actual definition of derivatives now. Derivatives, in essence, are gambling side bets in the financial markets that have a purpose. They are instruments of fraud intended to bilk the unaware and unsuspecting masses of people out of their hard-earned money by forcing them to gamble even when they don't know they are. Very few people actually deal directly in derivatives, but the general public are all exposed to them through their banks, pension funds, superannuation funds, insurance policies, and electricity, food and fuel bills. That's my definition. That's come from quite a bit of research lately. But I want to talk about something that we were involved in as the CEC back in 1993. Because in that year, Lyndon LaRouche, the American statesman and physical economist, his organisation produced a pamphlet called Tax Derivatives Speculation. And he has a quote in there. Now, bear in mind, the understanding of derivatives at the time was very, very small. Like, very few people had any real understanding or appreciation of what these things were. And here's LaRouche. He was an expert on derivatives. He's an expert in economics. And he examined these things and he saw through them straight away. And this is what he said, and I was struck by reading this recently. He said this back in 1993. Derivatives are an investment in something for which there is really no security, which takes wealth, money in the form of wealth, out of the productive and trading process and never puts anything back in. What we have is the prospect of a derivatives bubble, which grows like a cancer at the expense of its host and shrinks its host at the same time that its appetite is growing, while the means of satisfying that appetite are collapsing. Not a very sound investment.
There was a caricature at that time, Robbie, I remember very distinctly, of this giant flea on the dog.
Yeah.
It's
The
all right.
1,000-pound flea on the dog.
Yeah. So whilst the flea is happily sucking the blood out of the dog, the problem is when the dog dies, what happens to the flea? The flea will die eventually too because there's no blood left, right? And this goes back to LaRouche's work in 1993, a pamphlet he put out called Tax Speculation. It goes exactly to this subject. And it was so important at that time that it was picked up in the Australian Financial Review a year later.
Because we distributed it around the country. We imported these pamphlets, and the Fin Review, I think, well, that's an example that derivatives were so new, the Financial Review did a feature on these new instruments, and they opened up by quoting LaRouche.
Yes, and look what's happened since. When LaRouche says, you know, a derivatives bubble which grows like a cancer. Yeah. Now we're talking about $1.4 quadrillion in this bubble. right, of this derivative speculative bubble, of which Australia has 27 trillion at least just turning over on over the counter derivatives. 127 trillion. Sorry, yeah, 127, and just in turnover. And this is from the Australian Financial Markets Association, which specialise actually and are only just growing out of this completely deregulated market.
Well, let's talk about the fraud side of this, because at the time LaRouche was writing this, like I said, he's coming at it from an economist standpoint, of a physical economist. There was a man working for Bankers Trust and then Morgan Stanley on Wall Street, and his name was Frank Partnoy. And within a few years he quit, because he thought, if I continue working in this derivative, he was a derivative salesman, he said, if I continue working in this, I'm going to end up in jail. So he quit, and he wrote some very important books to expose the heart of this, right? And everything he wrote confirmed what LaRouche was saying without knowing these insiders at the time. He describes how the trading environment was a vicious, primal trading culture, and that was encouraged. These Wall Street banks, Craig, would recruit ex-military guys onto their trading floor to give their traders a killer instinct, right? He quotes the CEO of Morgan Stanley. Now, Morgan Stanley was Australia's bank on Wall Street, by the way, the investment bank Australia went to get money for the government. John Mack, the CEO, ordered in 1994, when there was a big derivatives losses, and it was Morgan Stanley's own clients making those losses on products Morgan Stanley had sold them. John Mack said, we can make more money out of these suckers, and his expression was, there's blood in the water, let's go kill someone. The standard jargon derivatives traders used when they would make a huge commission selling a product to a client that lost them money was, I've ripped his face off. Right? This was the attitude, and of course the poor sucker clients don't know this. Partnoy records how the derivatives were structured to allow banks to get around government regulations. And I want to read this quote from him, because regulations are designed to protect essential parts of the economy, right? Here's his quote. In early 1994, Mexico was hot. The US had recently passed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and bankers were racing south to Mexico City. Latin American derivatives were the fastest growing portion of the derivatives market. Every major American bank wanted to skim some of the anticipated flow of money between Mexico and the US. At the time, many US bankers regarded the Mexican banks as cash piñatas and were eager to smash them open. Right? Now, those Mexican banks were government-owned banks, right? And what was interesting about that, of course, is that's the same time that our Commonwealth Bank is being privatised by and sold into. We can put up on the screen the ownership of Australia's big banks, the HSBC, JP Morgan, Citigroup, and National Nominees are the big four shareholders in all major Australian banks and corporations. Those are the biggest players in derivatives, right? They smashed open our Commonwealth Bank to extract its profits that used to be part of the public good. Go to them. Same thing. Partnoy records this growth rate that we've talked about in derivatives. Partnoy records, Craig, that the only thing that made that possible is the deals these derivative salesmen sold. They sold to fund managers. So they sold to the people who manage pension funds, super funds, insurance funds, municipal funds. These fund managers, they weren't betting their own money. They're betting other people's money, yeah. Right? They're betting your money, the viewer of this program. And then Partnoy records, this is the most important bit, that these derivatives were structured to hide losses. And we talked about this recently on the CEC report, but it gives the example of a bucket of gold, where if half the bucket of gold is fool's gold, half is real gold, totally it's worth $100, but the fool's gold's worth only 10. The real gold is worth 90, but if you average them out and you can say they're worth $50 each, and then sell the part the real that you say is worth 50, but sell it for 90, what it's really worth, you can claim a profit of $40, which you'll get away with if you don't sell the other half.
Yeah, that's
right?
the trick.
And we can put a thing on the screen for that. They structured derivatives to put crap assets with good assets and do that kind of thing and hide losses in a big way. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about the implications of that for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and Australia's other banks. Welcome welcome back to this special CEC report on derivatives. Derivatives will kill because that's what they're made to do. Now, Craig, before the break, we were talking about how this Frank Partnoy wrote in his book, Fiasco, Blood in the Water on Wall Street, that everything, what he reported as an insider of the derivatives trade was everything that we had warned about and LaRouche had warned about as far back as 1993. Well, and he also talked about how they hide losses. And he used the example of the bucket of gold. Now let's talk about how that relates to Australia. And we'll set the scene. In 1987, Australia's big three private banks went bankrupt in the 87 crash. The government had to prop them up behind the scenes. Then you had the Commonwealth Bank, and in 87 I mean, and then they privatised it and threw that to the wolves of the private banking industry. And we'll put on the screen the growth in derivatives that of all our banks, and our Commonwealth Bank has gone from having the lowest derivatives to the highest derivatives. But then you have this interesting period, Craig, since 2008. Because in 2008, our banks were all caught out by their overseas borrowings, their dependence on foreign borrowings. They were just as bankrupt as the other banks in the world, but they were propped up behind the scenes. And curiously, their profits since 2008 have skyrocketed from an economy that's not in very good shape, right? So their profits have gone through the roof. There's only one thing that's kept pace with their profits.
The derivatives.
The derivatives.
Yeah.
And you can have a look at the graphs of that. And the bank that's the most profitable, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, the latest one, I think, the $27 billion the banks have just announced between them for this year as profits. The bank that's the most profitable has had the highest growth rate in its derivatives. Right? It's gone from the lowest in the 90s to the second highest today. We can only say the second highest because all of a sudden they had this rapid growth rate in derivatives exposure, and then in 2012 they suddenly decided we're no longer going to disclose this figure.
Well, if you look at the total growth, Robbie, it's 23 trillion up until June. Now we haven't got the last period, so it's 23 trillion. Now that's up from 21.5 trillion. And as I've said before, how do you get $1.5 trillion growth in derivatives in just 3 months? And this coincides with these huge profits. What if they started selling that other bucket of gold, Robbie, that's only got 10% gold and 40% garbage? Yep. I mean, that's the question here. The derivatives are used to hide losses. Well, and it's the taxpayer that's been bailing out these banks. Now we're looking at this question of bail-in.
And one of the favourite things that they like making derivative bets on, Craig, is mortgages. And the mortgage sector is what Australia's banks are the most heavily exposed to.
I heard saw figures for 88% of the major big four are into the property market, Robbie.
So in the time we've got left, when we talk about Glass-Steagall, we're not saying that Glass-Steagall might be necessary. We're saying it is necessary because our banks are going to crash at this rate.
At the present time, as we said, the polemic is we don't want to kill people, right? If you go with this current system, it will kill people. Glass-Steagall will kill off the speculation and save the people.
Yep.
That is what we are trying to fight for, Robbie. That's why we have to have Glass-Steagall, because the way it's working now, as acknowledged by Joe Hockey, the $500 billion debt ceiling fight that's currently in Parliament, the reason for that is there is going to be another crash. So we've got no choice but the solution of Glass-Steagall.
So get onto our website or call us and order a special pamphlet that we're producing on Glass-Steagall legislation for Australia, and all this we've just gone through will be laid out and you'll know why Glass-Steagall is a solution. But thanks for tuning in to this special edition of the CEC report.